Hello everyone, Dr. Peta Stapleton here. I wanted to share with you an overview of all of the EFT tapping research that we've actually done here at Bond University in the area of food cravings, weight loss, weight management over time. So we started way back at another university where I happened to be positioned in 2010, and that was the first time that we actually had run any trials in the area of EFT for food cravings. Now my clinical area happened to be eating disorders, and so we were thinking about, the research team and I, some different ideas of how we might be able to apply tapping in some of that space. Ultimately, the reason why we chose weight loss and food cravings being a big part of that was purely because at the time here in Australia, we did indeed have an obesity crisis. It is an ongoing one as well, and we potentially, looking at sample size, thought perhaps we would be able to attract more numbers to be involved in that trial. Now, as the story goes, and I have talked about this in different podcasts and my book, The Science Behind Tapping and things like that, my boss at the time, who was a very conservative general practitioner and MD, was a little bit concerned perhaps we wouldn't have anybody that might be interested in coming along and doing tapping on any trigger foods. And he actually said, look, give it a go, but not sure you'll actually attract anybody to come. So I did at the time go on a local current affair program just to demonstrate tapping. I worked with the reporter who had a gigantic chocolate muffin just to demonstrate what we would be doing. We offered a free 4-week program, 2 hours a week at the university, and sat back to wait to see what happened. What did happen was we had over 4,500 people that responded to that trial. Of course, my boss at the time fell over. He didn't know what to do, and we stopped counting at 4,500 people. Of course, we couldn't assist that many, but it was the start of the research here in Australia in that area. So that very first trial, which of course is now published, and we did 12-month follow-up after that program, showed that 4 weeks, 2 hours a week. So we had an 8-hour treatment program, which we thought at the time was plenty of time to do tapping on trigger foods. And the idea being that if you no longer had a desire for certain foods that perhaps were high calorie and you lost the desire for those, then over time, of course, they wouldn't be part of your diet and you would actually obviously lose weight. That is what we found over that 12-month period. So the average weight loss was around 5 kilos, somewhere around 11 pounds in that system, and all of the things that we measured. So we looked at the power of food over a person. So how much power did they think that food had, the level of restraint ability that the person had over food, of course, severity of food craving. And then we looked at other psychological symptomology like, depression, anxiety, that type of thing, any somatic feelings, those sorts of things, as well as other demographic variables. Every single variable that we measured in that first trial showed positive outcomes at the end of 4 weeks, but were maintained 12 months later. Nobody had drifted back to where they started at that beginning of the trial, so our baseline. And the one variable that actually kept improving was restraint. So the restraint ability at 6 months was stronger than when we finished the trial at 4 weeks. So that was interesting, and we've actually used the same measure moving forward, and we've continued to show that particular measure shows improved restraint over time in this area. Now at 12 months, anecdotally, most of the people in our trial couldn't remember that the food that they'd actually done tapping on in that program. Of course, when we reminded them, they would laugh, and this has happened in all of the years gone by. They would laugh and just say, I can't remember the last time I ate that food. So indeed, we do get these outcomes where we're shifting something neurologically and the brain actually is rewiring itself, perhaps through that memory reconsolidation kind of process, that once there's no desire there for that food, of course, the brain actually has a different experience. So that was where we started. The very first trial, we did publish that. These publications are all available on my research website here at Bond University, so you can access all of those to read. Of course, when you go to publish this type of thing, and it's a new and an emerging technique, and you've got to remember this was 2011 and 12 that we were publishing, journals at the time raised the idea, critique okay, you might be showing that it actually does work, but how does it compare to other gold standard therapies? So of course that was the next trial that we ran. So by the time that trial came around, I was in my position here at Bond University in the School of Psychology in Queensland. So we continued the research, and obviously I'm still here to this day. So we actually compared EFT tapping to cognitive behavioural therapy for the same area, obese or overweight adults, in the area of food cravings, and of course applying that to things like emotional eating, restraint, willpower, and indeed looking at weight loss and maintenance over time. Now, we did have to extend the EFT program because 4 weeks of CBT is unheard of. That's not a long time in that gold standard approach. So we did an 8-week program. We compared 8 weeks of EFT to 8 weeks of cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, and our participants were randomly allocated. We use a computer system for that, so there is no choice. It minimises bias if someone wants to come into a trial to use tapping, because they might end up in the CBT program instead. So again, we've done 12-month follow-up on both of these. Now, what both of those programs showed was at the end of treatment, and indeed at that 6-month mark, they looked quite similar. So the EFT program, of course, got the same outcomes we got in the 4-week program. And we've actually compared that then to what the CBT participants achieved. Now, they did, by the end of treatment, of course, achieve a reduction in food cravings through changing their thinking styles, understanding emotions, that type of thing, a reduction in anxiety, food cravings, and some of those other elements, of course. But what had happened at 12 months, so by the time we got a year down the track, the EFT participants had maintained all of their outcomes. Nothing had drifted back to baseline. Again, they forgot what they'd actually done their tapping on. But the CBT participants, particularly in the area of food cravings and also anxiety, had actually drifted back to where they had started. So the food cravings had actually come back. So those types of outcomes are really interesting to have a look at long term, that an 8-week program might indeed show outcomes that are very similar. And of course, we were able to say that EFT was non-inferior to a gold standard approach in this area. But when you have a look at the follow-up, that's where it actually shows some of those outcomes start to deviate, that type of thing. So after we published all of that, we actually went into the online space. Now, this was somewhere around 2015, 16. We were curious as to how the delivery of the program, in order to reach more people perhaps in rural and remote locations, but also if cost was actually an issue. So we actually designed an 8-week program that was self-paced, that was video delivered, built onto a platform, of course, where people could log in. And the videos were myself. So everything we'd learnt through those programs, we actually delivered through videos. They did have access to myself and another researcher in this space in between their weekly sessions in order to ask questions. So they had an online group where they could actually reach out, ask us, talk about anything that was coming up, get some guidance and advice. Ultimately, that program showed the same outcomes as our live in-person programs that we've been running in the years previous. So doing it, self-pacing, of course, we built things in like they couldn't move ahead to the next module unless they'd completed the module. We didn't allow them to skip any videos that they felt weren't relevant. We made them watch all of them and do their tapping. So we had sort of some inbuilt things. We also had little quizzes built in and things like that. And of course, the online human support made a big difference. We ended up analysing statistically the data from that trial compared to the in-person trial and published that as a paper to actually show that those outcomes, when we compared them statistically, actually were equivalent as well. So that paper's actually been published. And one other that we compared from our post data was the 4-week program compared to the 8-week program. Now, they were our in-person trials, but we had a look at whether or not the 4-week program achieved the same outcomes as the 8-week, which it indeed did. But there was one small difference. For age group, the 8-week program was often better in achieving outcomes for people that were in that age bracket over 50 years of age. So there were some minor differences when we started to have a look at types of food as well. So carbohydrates often responded better to the 8-week program than it did the 4-week program, for example. But the age group was an interesting one. And what we proposed in the paper was perhaps, sometimes people wanted to take a little bit longer to have some of those ideas become more permanent through their tapping, or indeed by the time they got to them, they often were getting some of those outcomes in weeks 6, 7 and 8 of our programs. Ultimately, though, the 4-week program achieved the same outcomes, but when we started to drill down and have a look, of course, we did see some of those outcomes. So something to have a think about if indeed you're a practitioner and work in this field. Now, what did we do after that? Of course, we've been in this space for about 15 years now. I'd long held a dream that we would be able to do a brain scan study. So after we had actually compared, delivered our online program, done lots of those other comparisons with our data, I really wanted to have a look at what happens in the brain when we actually pre and post do tapping, but when we look at images of high calorie foods. So we actually were able to secure access to an MRI machine, which is quite close to the university here. We also attracted the funding for that. And we were able to put through just a small pilot group. So we had 15 participants, again, randomly allocated via computer to either the EFT group or a control group that didn't get any EFT intervention. Now, the numbers fell that 10 people ended up in the EFT group and 5 people ended up in the control group. But they all underwent an functional MRI scan at the start of the program. The EFT people then attended a 4-week tapping program for their food cravings, and the control group actually had nothing. But at the end of the 4 weeks, they came back to have that MRI scan again. Now, when they were inside the machine, they were wearing a headset that we were able to project images of high-calorie foods onto the headset so that they had to look at them and imagine eating or drinking those high-calorie foods so that we could see which parts of the brain actually activated during that. What we did see, and these brain scans are actually available on my website, so petastapleton.com. Under the tab, The Science Behind Tapping, you'll actually see the open access journal article publication about the brain scans as well. The parts of the brain that fire or light up where blood flow goes through thinking in a functional MRI were related to the reward pleasure center, but also the area that if we think about losing something, loss, potentially these people were in there looking at these images at the beginning going, I'm not going to want to eat these in 4 weeks' time. We actually saw that activating as well. So 4 weeks later, the control group had not changed at all, so time didn't do anything to their food cravings. But the group that had gone through their 4 weeks, 8 hours of tapping for those types of foods, including their own preferences, actually had such a significant lack of activation. You can see it on the brain scans. You cannot see any part of the brain activated or lighting up there. And you can see that as the yellow and red colours on the brain scans. What did that show us? It showed that looking at those images when there's no desire actually didn't have any area of the brain that had blood flow go to it. So therefore nothing actually was lighting up. So that was the first not only MRI scan of EFT in the world, but certainly the first one in food cravings to do with tapping. We, of course, are starting to look at those types of studies, MRI studies for other areas of health conditions moving forward. But that was a particularly good one, a landmark study. So where we got to at that point was really sitting back and looking at that we'd done so much research in the area of food cravings and weight loss and had definitively shown over time, we wondered how long it would last. So our last study that we've actually done in this area to date, which was published in 2019, was a 2-year follow-up of our online program. So all of the participants that had gone through the online program, and it was a worldwide study, so over 300 participants gone through that. We'd done 1-year follow-up and published that. We'd also compared it to the in-person trials. But then we did a 2-year follow-up on those participants to find out how were they 2 years down the track. And I'm proud to say that 2 years later, nothing had returned that we'd measured. So those same things, power over food, level of restraint ability, anything to do with severity of food cravings. Indeed, they couldn't remember what they'd actually tapped on as well. All of those other psychological symptoms, depression, anxiety, somatic feelings in the body, everything had stayed the same as when they first started, when they first finished that program. So nothing had reverted back to their baseline. So again, that one's published. Of course, we like to pick peer-reviewed journals so that we're actually publishing in quality journals out there academically. But keen to kind of spread the message that tapping lasts over time. Of course, there's lots of different theories. The one that we do tend to talk about in the EFT world is the idea of memory reconsolidation, that if at the same time you're having a certain emotion, feeling, in this case it was desire for a food, and at the same time as that feeling you actually have an opposite, a calming response. Of course, that's our tapping technique. The brain is unable to hold both of those feelings at the same time, so it actually starts to collapse. So that type of thing, of course, 2 years down the track, we'll probably leave those people alone now and not follow them up, because it started to get to the point where we were saying, so how's your food craving? And they couldn't even remember anything that they'd done their tapping on. And when we reminded them, of course, they laughed and said, I haven't actually eaten that food for as long as I can remember, and I don't even have any desire for it. So fabulous outcomes in this space. We have turned our attention now at Bond University into the area of chronic pain. So we are indeed conducting an MRI study around chronic pain, and we're looking at different delivery types of that program as well. So a bit of a watch this space as far as what comes out in the future, but I hope that gives you some confidence that in the area of, indeed, the last 15 years of my research career has been in the food, weight maintenance, weight loss space for EFT, and I can absolutely tell you not only does it work, but it lasts over time. I'm Peta Stapleton here at Bond University in Queensland, Australia, and I do hope that if anything comes out of this, it might be all positive and you'll keep tapping on all of the things that we've talked about. Indeed, reach out if any questions come up and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. Have a lovely week, everybody, and I look forward to talking again soon.